March 6th, 2008. Late afternoon, local time. The 27th floor of the Sofitel Hotel in Bangkok, Thailand. Viktor Bout sat in a sterile conference room across from two men he believed were senior representatives of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. He had flown in for the meeting. He was sipping water from a glass. On the table in front of him was paper covered in his own handwriting, diagrams of airdrop routes, quantities, 100 surface-to-air missiles, 20,000 AK-47 rifles, 20,000 fragmentation grenades, 740 mortars, 350 sniper rifles, 5 tons of C4 explosives, 10 million rounds of ammunition. Bout looked across at the two men, told them the United States was his enemy too, and that their fight against America was also his fight. Moments later, Royal Thai police officers and Drug Enforcement Administration agents burst through the door. They cuffed him without a struggle. The richest, most untouchable arms broker in the post-Soviet world. A man Western intelligence agencies had tracked for the better part of 15 years across 4 continents, caught in a hotel room with a notepad and a glass of water. This wasn't just another smuggler. Viktor Anatolyevich Bout was the man Hollywood spent $42 million trying to portray. The man Nicolas Cage played in Lord of War, the 2005 Andrew Niccol film whose lead character, Yuri Orlov, was openly inspired by Bout's real-life trajectory. The character was a composite, blending Bout with 4 other gun runners, most notably the Lebanese Armenian dealer Sarkis Soganalian. But the spine of the movie, the accent, the aging Soviet cargo planes, the willingness to sell to anyone who could pay, that was Bout. At his peak, around 2008, his estimated net worth was reported as high as $6 billion. His fleet of Antonov and Ilyushin aircraft numbered more than 50 planes. United Nations investigators tied him to weapons shipments in Angola, Liberia, Sierra Leone, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, and Rwanda. The British Foreign Office Minister Peter Hain branded him the Merchant of Death, telling the House of Commons that Bout was the chief sanctions buster, ferrying arms into Africa's wars and carrying out the diamonds that paid for them. And then, for nearly a decade, he simply could not be caught. This is the story of how a Soviet army translator from a backwater republic built one of the most efficient illegal arms networks in modern history. How he flew weapons to genocidaires and warlords while simultaneously taking contracts that served the Pentagon. How a fake deal about Colombian rebels lured him into a Bangkok hotel room. And how in December 2022, after roughly a decade in a federal prison cell, he walked out of American custody, traded for a basketball player, only to start dealing weapons again. But here's what the headlines never told you. Bout wasn't just a criminal. He was a logistics genius, operating in the rubble of a collapsed empire. And the world, including the United States, used him until it didn't. To understand Viktor Bout, you have to go back to Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, a dusty Soviet outpost wedged between Afghanistan, China, and the spine of the Pamir Mountains. He was born there on January 13th, 1967. Working-class family, Russian ethnicity in a Muslim-majority republic. His older brother, Sergei, would become his lifelong business partner. As a kid, Viktor was quiet, intense, and freakishly gifted with languages. He had been fluent in Esperanto since around the age of 12, a member of the Dushanbe Esperanto Club. That talent steered him away from a normal conscript's fate. He studied at the Soviet Military Institute of Foreign Languages in Moscow, one of the most secretive academies in the entire USSR, an institution long linked to the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. There he mastered 5 foreign languages: Portuguese, English, French, Arabic, and Farsi. He served as a translator with Soviet military missions tied to Africa, where Moscow was backing communist governments in their endless proxy wars. He is generally said to have left the military around the time the Soviet Union collapsed. Sources disagree on his exact rank, from lieutenant to major in the GRU. What is certain is that in December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. This was the moment that made Viktor Bout. Across the former USSR, the most heavily armed military in the history of the world simply stopped being paid. Entire arsenals were left unguarded, tank battalions, helicopter squadrons, warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with Kalashnikov rifles, RPG-7 launchers, anti-aircraft missiles, and ammunition by the metric ton. Officers, desperate to feed their families, started selling everything. And the cargo aircraft of the former Soviet Air Force, the massive Antonov, An-12s and Ilyushin Il-76s. Those were available too, for pennies on the dollar. Bout saw the opening before almost anyone else. In 1993, with money sources he never fully explained, he founded his first air freight company based in Belgium. The story he always told was that he had simply purchased aging Antonovs at auction. The reality, according to Douglas Farah and Stephen Braun, whose book Merchant of Death remains a definitive investigation, was that Bout had inside access military contacts. People who could pull aircraft and crews out of cold storage and put them in his hands for almost nothing. By the mid-1990s, he had moved his base of operations to Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. He registered a new company, Airses, followed by Centrafrican Airlines, Airpass, Sanair General Trading, and a string of other shell entities scattered across Liberia, South Africa, the Central African Republic, and beyond. His older brother, Sergei, eventually took over day-to-day control of Airses. The fleet grew. By the late 1990s, investigators estimated that Bout controlled around 60 aircraft. Most were the workhorse Antonov, An-12s. Some were the massive Il-76 freighters, capable of hauling 50 tons of cargo and landing on dirt strips. He had pilots. He had mechanics. He had forged end-user certificates from sympathetic governments. And he had a business model that was, in pure logistics terms, brilliant. He would fly weapons into a conflict zone, drop them with the buyer, and on the return trip, fly out something legal. Frozen chicken, cut flowers, mining equipment, sometimes gladioli from South Africa. The planes never flew empty. The profit margins were obscene. His first major war was Angola. The country was tearing itself apart in a civil war between the government, the MPLA, and the UNITA rebels led by Jonas Savimbi. The United Nations had placed UNITA under a strict arms embargo. Bout didn't care. According to UN investigators, Airses was a principal transporter of weapons flown from Burgas Airport in Bulgaria to UNITA-controlled airstrips inside Angola. Between 1996 and 1999, investigators documented dozens of Bout-linked flights supplying Savimbi's rebels with rifles, mortars, anti-aircraft guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The total value of weapons moved during that Angolan operation was estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. And here is the most chilling detail. Bout was also, at various times, connected to logistics work on the other side of the war. He saw no contradiction. As the character in Lord of War puts it, he just wanted to deliver. Politics was for other people. From Angola, the network expanded. In Liberia, Bout became one of the principal suppliers to Charles Taylor, the warlord-turned-president whose campaign of terror across West Africa would later result in his conviction for aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. In exchange for weapons, Taylor paid in diamonds and timber concessions. The arrangement bled across the border into Sierra Leone, where Taylor was sponsoring the Revolutionary United Front, the rebel group infamous for amputating the hands and arms of civilians. The weapons that armed those amputators, some of them came off Viktor Bout's aircraft. In Rwanda, his planes were alleged to have operated during the 1994 genocide, in which an estimated 800,000 people were slaughtered in 100 days. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, his network was tied to multiple factions of the Second Congo War, a conflict so devastating it killed an estimated 5 million people. And then in the mid-1990s, he built the relationship that nearly ended his career a decade early. He began dealing with the Taliban. Bout's relationship with the Taliban was complicated. It began, of all places, with a hostage crisis. In August 1995, one of his cargo planes, an Ilyushin IL-76, carrying ammunition destined for the Rabbani government in Kabul, was forced down by the Taliban at Kandahar. The crew was held captive for over a year. After protracted negotiations, the crew eventually escaped in 1996. But out of that ordeal, a working relationship with senior Taliban figures took shape. Within a few years, his network was supplying the Taliban regime itself, providing aircraft to its national carrier, Ariana Afghan Airlines, through AirSES and partners like Flying Dolphin. Those planes flew weapons. They flew opium. According to some investigations, they may at times have carried senior al-Qaeda figures, though this has never been fully established. And here is where the story takes its most uncomfortable turn. Because around the same period, Bout was supplying the Taliban. His network was also tied to their bitter enemies, the Northern Alliance, the forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud, both sides of the Afghan war. From the same Sharjah hangar, to Bout, it was just freight. You can't operate at that scale without protection. By the late 1990s, investigators believed Bout had built informal ties to elements of Russian intelligence. His operations conveniently aligned with Moscow's strategic interests across Africa and Central Asia. He laundered money through Sharjah and through a network of front companies managed by Richard Amar Chichakli, a naturalized American businessman of Syrian origin who became Bout's chief financial fixer. Chichakli set up shell corporations across places like Texas, Delaware, and offshore havens. He moved money through these accounts to keep Bout's air fleet fueled, maintained, and crewed. In April 2005, the United States Treasury Department hit back hard. It identified 30 companies and 4 individuals linked to Bout in a single action under Executive Order 13348, including Sergei Bout, Chichakli, and senior managers Sergei Denisenko and Valery Nado. On paper, the network was crippled. In reality, almost nothing changed. And here is the part of the story that nobody in Washington wanted to discuss. While the Treasury was freezing his assets, American war logistics were paying him. After the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the United States military needed cargo aircraft, hundreds of them, to haul tents, ammunition, water, food, and construction supplies into war zones. There simply weren't enough legitimate carriers to handle the volume. So American contractors and subcontractors, including air freight firms like FedEx and Falcon Express Cargo, chartered planes, and many of those planes belonged to companies connected to Viktor Bout. According to investigations and the reporting of Farah and Braun, Bout-linked firms received roughly $60 million for flights supporting United States operations in Iraq, flying an estimated 1,000 supply trips into and out of the country between 2003 and 2005. The same man on the United States Treasury blacklist was being paid, indirectly, by the American war effort at the same time. Bout, when later asked about it, just laughed. Business is business. By 2007, the walls were beginning to close. United Nations panels had named him in report after report. Belgian prosecutors had issued a warrant. He could no longer fly into most of the European Union. He was, in his own words, semi-retired. He was living in Moscow with his wife, Alla, whom he had married in 1992, and his daughter, Elizaveta, born in 1994. He drove his daughter to school in the mornings. He read history books obsessively. He kept a vegetarian diet, an unusual choice for a Russian businessman of his generation. He was 40 years old. He had everything, and he was, by many accounts, profoundly bored. That boredom is what the DEA exploited. In late 2007, an elite Special Operations Division unit, the same team that had recently brought down the Syrian arms dealer, Mansour al-Qassar, identified Bout as their next target. They codenamed the operation. Operation Relentless. The plan was elegant. They would dangle the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, in front of him. The DEA knew, from documents seized at a FARC camp in Ecuador, that the rebel group was genuinely trying to buy surface-to-air missiles. That detail gave the cover story credibility. They also knew, from intelligence assessments by experts like Douglas Farah and the investigator Kathy Lynn Austin, that Bout had reportedly dealt with the FARC before, back in 1999, in an arrangement facilitated by Vladimiro Montesinos, the former head of Peruvian intelligence. 5 separate shipments, 10,000 Kalashnikov rifles, airdropped over Colombia. Bout had no direct relationship with the FARC commanders, but he believed they were credible buyers. That assumption killed him. The operation worked in 3 stages. Stage 1. The DEA used a confidential informant, Mike Snow, a South African aviation man who knew Bout's old circle. Snow lured Bout's longtime associate, Andrew Smulyan, a pilot in his late 60s who had moved freight with Bout for years, into the trap. Smulyan carried the deal back to Bout. Stage 2. DEA agents posing as FARC representatives, 2 seasoned informants named Carlos Sagastume and Ricardo Hardnero, former soldiers turned cooperating sources, going by the cover names Eduardo and El Comandante, met with Smulyan in Curacao, in the southern Caribbean. They told him they wanted to buy a serious arsenal. Smulyan flew to Moscow. He pitched the deal to Bout. Stage 3. The face-to-face meeting. Bangkok, March 2008. Bout walked in. Bout sat down. Bout sketched out routes and quantities on paper. And when the supposed FARC representatives explained that the surface-to-air missiles would be used against American helicopters in Colombia, Bout did not flinch. He told them their enemy was his enemy. Every word was on a hidden microphone. Every gesture was on hidden cameras. The trap closed. The arrest set off a long diplomatic war between the United States and Russia. Moscow demanded his return. Bout's lawyers fought extradition through every level of the Thai court system. Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov personally lobbied for his release. Bout himself, sitting in a Bangkok jail cell, kept giving interviews insisting he was just a legitimate freight businessman caught up in a political vendetta. It didn't matter. After Thai courts ruled in Washington's favor, on November 16, 2010, he was flown directly to New York. Federal agents were waiting on the tarmac. The photograph from that day shows Bout, stocky, mustached, hands cuffed at his waist, being led off a DEA jet near New York. He had a slight, almost amused, smile on his face. The trial began on October 12, 2011, at the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. The prosecution played the Bangkok tapes for the jury. They put Andrew Smulyan on the stand. Smulyan had pleaded guilty and was cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence. He testified that Bout had been willing to discuss the FARC deal in detail. The defense argued that Bout had only been playing along, that his real aim was to sell 2 cargo planes, that he had no real intention of delivering the weapons, that the entire operation was American entrapment of a Russian citizen on foreign soil. The jury did not buy it. On November 2, 2011, after a 3-week trial, they convicted Viktor Bout on all 4 counts: conspiracy to kill United States nationals, conspiracy to kill United States officers and employees, conspiracy to acquire and use anti-aircraft missiles, and conspiracy to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. On April 5, 2012, Judge Shira Scheindlin sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, the minimum the law allowed. She made it clear from the bench that she did not believe Bout would have committed these crimes but for the sting. Prosecutors had asked for life. She gave the mandatory minimum, 25 years. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, a medium-security federal prison in southern Illinois. He spent roughly a decade there. He read constantly. He painted in his cell. He kept studying languages. He gave a series of interviews insisting he had been framed. His wife and daughter visited him when American visa rules allowed it. And then in 2022, his entire situation changed because of one event that had nothing to do with arms dealing. On February 17, 2022, the American basketball player Brittany Griner was detained at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow with vape cartridges containing cannabis oil in her luggage. 1 week later, on February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. The political stakes around her case exploded. By the autumn of 2022, the only realistic trade Moscow would accept for Griner was Viktor Bout. The Biden administration agonized over the deal. Pentagon and DEA officials warned that releasing Bout would put one of the most dangerous logistics operators on the planet back in circulation. They were overruled. On December 8, 2022, on the tarmac at an airport in Abu Dhabi, the swap took place. Brittany Griner walked toward an American plane. Viktor Bout walked toward a Russian one. Hours later, he was back on Russian soil, greeted as a hero. His homecoming was carefully choreographed. He gave press interviews. He went on television. He praised Vladimir Putin. He criticized the West. He announced he would enter politics. Within a year, he was elected to the regional parliament of the Ulyanovsk region as a member of the ultra-nationalist Liberal Democratic Party of Russia. The state press treated him like a returning soldier. But the more troubling reports came later. In 2024, the Wall Street Journal reported that Bout was back in the arms business. According to the investigation, he was negotiating to broker small arms to the Houthi militia in Yemen, the exact group that had been firing missiles at international shipping in the Red Sea. The Russian government, of course, denied everything, but the pattern was unmistakable. The merchant of death was back at his old desk. Andrew Smulian finished his cooperation and was released. Richard Chichakli, the financial fixer, was arrested in Australia in 2013, extradited, convicted later that year, and sentenced in 2014 to 5 years in federal prison for money laundering, wire fraud, and sanctions violations. Bout's brother Sergei remains in Russia, untouched by any Western prosecution. The Lord of War, as Andrew Nichols' film called him, returned to a country that had always quietly protected him. Here is what Viktor Bout's story actually reveals. He was not a Hollywood villain. He was a symptom. He was what the world looked like after the Soviet Union collapsed, and nobody bothered to count the guns. He thrived in the gap between borders, between laws, and between the public positions of governments and their private operational needs. The United States blacklisted him while his planes served its war effort. The United Nations sanctioned him while his aircraft flew under a dozen different flags. And when he was finally caught, he was caught not because the system worked, but because one elite DEA unit ran a hyper-specific sting that depended on his own boredom and his own arrogance. The Lord of War was never just one man. It was a market. And as long as that market exists, as long as there are unguarded arsenals, failed states, and buyers willing to pay cash, there will always be another Viktor Bout. The next one is probably already flying. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new investigative documentary every week. And drop a comment below. What real-life criminal mastermind deserves a full feature next?